Our second segment is also within the neuroscience of ethics, but it asks a specific question about the definition of morality. Is morality really a single unified thing? Now, what we've seen so far is judgments of harm, personal and impersonal, being associated with different brain areas. Let's look at a different part of morality, fairness and distributive justice. Not whether you're harming or not, but instead, how do you distribute harms and benefits among different people? Now here, Ming Xu made a wonderful study in 2008 where he looked at the difference between equity and efficiency. And here's the design. It was really a lot like a trolley. If you look at that diagram, you can see there's a little red dot that's almost like a trolley, and it moves from right to left through the hole in the barrier, and then there's a rod that it hits, which sends it either to the upper left or to the lower left. He used actual orphans in Uganda who were hungry and needed food, and he divided them into groups where some groups had one child and other groups had two children. And each child received 24 meals. But participants decided how many meals to take away from those children, actually take meals away from them. None of them ended up with less than they started with. So they all benefited. So in the diagram, in the upper left, one child in the group loses 13 meals and the other loses 5 meals. So that's 18 total. In the lower left, the child loses 15 meals. So it's more efficient to send the red ball to hit the child in the lower left, and then they lose 15. Smaller number of meals lost. But wait a minute, then there's one child that's singled out as losing 15 and nobody else loses anything. Whereas in the upper diagram, there's less difference between the two children who are affected. So it's more equitable. So if you favor equity, you're going to go to upper left. If you favor efficiency, you're going to go to lower left. And by doing situation after situation, we can find out which you value and how you weight them against each other. It's interesting that there were 3 periods: the display period, where the red dot went from the right to that barrier with a hole in the middle. Then the switch period, where you could switch the angle of the rod so that the ball would bounce off and go upper left, or bounce down and go lower left. That's the switch period between the hole in the barrier and hitting the rod. And then there's the hit period when it hits the group of children. And he could look at the brain activity at all 3 of those points. Here's what he found. During the display period, the putamen was active in a way that was correlated with efficiency, but not equity. So it looks like the putamen is being used to process efficiency. During display and switch periods, the insula activity was correlated with equity, but not with efficiency. So it looks like insula activity is correlated with equity. Indeed, he could look at the insula activity and predict which individuals were going to take the option which avoided inequity. So now we've got different parts of the brain associated with efficiency or harm than are associated with equity or distributive justice. And those are 2 of John Haidt's moral foundations. Harm is one thing that morality cares about. Fairness and reciprocity and equity is another thing that morality cares about. But John Haidt points out that those 2 things are very common in Western culture, or at least some people in Western culture. But in many cultures, in-group and loyalty matter. Don't be unpatriotic. Don't be a bad friend. You need to be faithful to your friends. Authority and respect, you shouldn't disobey your parents or the laws. And purity and sanctity, you shouldn't commit cannibalism or incest. Now, according to Haidt, all 5 of these, and actually later more were added, but all 5 of these are still considerations that count in morality. And what he found, now we're talking about a Western sample, but it holds in other areas as well. But in the West, at least, people who are very liberal tend to put a lot of emphasis on harm and fairness, and a lot less emphasis on in-group loyalty, that is, and authority and purity, whereas people who are more conservative tend to put approximately the same weight on all 5 foundations. So which part of morality you emphasize is going to make a big difference in your life and your political affiliations. But what about the brain? Haidt's not studying the brain. He's looking at the psychology of it. So a group of us here at Duke decided we wanted to find out, are these differences among the different moral foundations reflected in differences in brain activity? And here's how we did it. You take a scenario like you see a teenager urinating in the wave pool at a crowded water park. Now that's a question of purity. And you ask, well, is that not morally wrong, or is it extremely morally wrong, or is it somewhere in the middle, 1 to 4 scale? You ask, you see a referee intentionally making bad calls that help his favored team win. Well, that's not fair, and so it falls under the fairness foundation. And again, is that not morally wrong, or is it extremely morally wrong, or is it somewhere in the middle on a 1 to 4 scale? And you ask people a whole bunch of these different scenarios or vignettes. Notice that they're all you see it, so you're thinking about it from the same perspective in all the different cases. And what did we find? Well, if you look at the lower right, what we found was that the areas that were associated with morality, that is, the moral foundations, were very different from the areas associated with non-moral social norms, like you shouldn't wear pajamas to work or to class. The areas associated with the moral foundations were superior frontal gyrus, inferior frontal gyrus, posterior cingulate, angular gyrus. You can look at the details in the paper, but for social norms, it was insula and postcentral gyrus. So you've already got the brain marking a distinction between these moral areas and the social norms. But then within morality, if you look at the top A figure or panel, then you'll see that loyalty and purity activated the brain in very different ways from the other foundations, from the individualizing foundations of harm and fairness, but also from the binding foundation of authority. So we found that loyalty and purity really stood out. These results don't fully support the foundations theory because authority didn't come out, but at least they show that there are some differences among these different foundations in the way that they're activated in the brain. And we did then a non-rotated analysis. That was a mean-centered. This is non-rotated. Again, you don't have to worry about the technical details. The point is that a different analysis confirmed the original results, that loyalty and purity come out as foundations quite different from the other foundations. And so there are differences within morality between the types of moral judgments that you're making and the brain areas that are activated when you make those moral judgments. So what conclusion do you draw from all this? Well, it looks like there's no single brain network or mechanism that's common to all moral judgments. Some brain activation is associated with one kind of moral judgment, but not the others. And there's nothing that's common to all of them. There's also no brain network or mechanism that's used for only moral judgments, but not used outside of morality. So sure, morality is associated with emotions, but there are also non-moral emotions like fear and surprise that activate similar brain networks. Sure, you learn morality in a model-free or a model-based way, but we learn lots of things in those two different ways, not just morality. There's non-moral learning as well. Sure, there are rules in morality, but there are also rules outside of morality, like language rules and dancing, how should you dance, and rules of games. Sure, morality involves social cognition. You have to be able to read the minds of the people that you are judging as agents, but also of the victims who get hurt in the scenario. So it involves social cognition, but there's lots of social cognition. Like when you're talking to someone, you have to figure out whether they're bored with what you're saying. And that's reading their mind in a way. So all of these things are involved in morality, but they're not involved only in morality. And therefore, moral judgments are not unified in the brain. Now, they still might be unified in some other way, such as by function. I happen to think they're not unified at any level, but this talk is about neural mechanisms, and so the main conclusion here is simply that moral judgments are not unified by some single mechanism that works for all moral judgments and only moral judgments. People have given up trying to find anything like that because the evidence just does not suggest any such mechanism. And that's the end of our second segment and the end of our discussion of the neuroscience of ethics. Next, we'll turn to the ethics of neuroscience.